Tikka the Enchanted, a Pale Ring story. Written and narrated by Brian McKee. Chapter 1. The Arch. "Careful now, lass," Bratigan said from the side. Tikka rolled her eyes and shot her mentor a glance. The old dwarf sat in a sturdy wooden chair beside the squat iron table in the heart of the workshop. His hands were folded politely in his lap and away from the metal surface where Tikka was doing her work. She could see how his fingers kept nervously tapping together, though, betraying his nerves.
"Brad, really? You need to stop worrying. I got this,"
she chirped, standing upright and holding her engraving needle up with confidence.
"And besides, you have your own work to be doing. Your lecture isn't gonna write itself, you know."
Bratigan waved Tika off dismissively, leaning back in his seat. The old chair gave off an audible creak of protest. That day's out. Besides, can you blame me for wanting to watch my little girl growing up?" Tika slammed a hand to her chest in mock scandalization.
"Growing up? Me? Never."
Bratigan chuckled, but he said nothing more. He waved at her again, gesturing for her to get back to work. She rolled her eyes, then turned her attention back to the lantern. It was one of a set, and over the course of the last 3 days, it had been her job to imbue each and every one of them with a simple enchantment that would dramatically increase the radius of the candle burning inside. Each one had taken hours of effort, and this was to be the last. Its brethren were all neatly stored in a sturdy wooden crate under the table. This was her big test. The last step in proving to Bratigan that she was well and truly an enchantress in her own right. She had been Bratigan's student for many years now, and this was to be her last. In the time she had lived under his roof, Bratigan had taught her nearly all of his most closely kept secrets. Of course, getting to this point had been a tricky affair. The first 3 years of her tutelage under Bratigan had been spent largely as an assistant, while they worked through the basics. Sadly, Bratigan had failed to take into account Tikka's impeccable memory and sharp mind as a Kraven, and as such held off on teaching her the actual techniques for far longer than was ideal. It had taken a particularly expensive incident with a flying stuffed doll to finally get the dwarf to recognize that Tikka was ready to learn in earnest. She took in a deep breath, then let it out in a low avian whistle. She ruffled her tail feathers, puffed up her chest, and returned to the task at hand. The scraping of metal filled the air as she inscribed the last 3 of the arcane runes needed for the enchantment into the lantern's metallic frame. Her ears stung slightly at the shrill sound, but her focus did not waver. Once the runes were etched, she reached over and flipped open the lid of a small wooden box she had off to one side. Cradled within in soft velvet was a glowing white stone, about the size of her open palm. A ring stone, and it had already been engraved with the needed runes. The leftover dust from the runes was kept in a glass vial beside the stone. Tikka carefully affixed the stone to the roof of the lantern with a quick application of glue. Then she carefully poured the dust in the vial into the empty engravings. She went letter by letter, word by word, being careful to keep the dust evenly distributed. Once a line of runes was done, she went over it with a brush dipped into a jar filled with a thick, clear, viscous fluid. She held a candle up to the liquid once it had been applied, causing it to dry and harden into a potent seal that would contain the dust. She routinely leaned over to double-check the papers scattered across the table. Each one was filled to the margins with sketches, diagrams, notes, and measurements. She had to make sure the runes were perfect. If they were even a few degrees off, or the proportions did not match exactly, the whole enchantment could go wrong. And seeing as they were working with something that contained literal fire, Something going wrong had the potential to be very dangerous. But she found no flaws in her markings or her runes. In short order, all of the dust had been distributed and sealed. Tika released a breath she did not realize she had been holding and set the lantern upright on the table. She took a step back, removing her monocle and blinking a few times as the world came back into proper focus. She looked over at Bratigan and smirked.
And there we go. All done.
Bratigan rose from his seat, his knees popping a few times on the way. Well then, let's see how you did, lass, he said. Tika took a step back to get out of his way and folded her hands respectfully behind her back. But there was no hiding the smug look in her eye.
Oh, I got this.
Bratigan lifted the lantern in his thick hands and turned it over multiple times, inspecting every rune with a discerning eye. He rapped his knuckles against the frame in more than one place, and even scraped his fingernails across several of the runes as if to try and break them. Tika wasn't worried, though. Her seals were good. Bratigan would have to put in a lot of effort to disrupt them. Bratigan hummed thoughtfully and rubbed at his graying red beard. Well, all appears to be in order. The runes are all the right size. Ringstone is nice and secure. I'm not seeing any dents or malformities in the metal from your work. Seals are solid. They'll hold for a good few years at least. Tika puffed up more and more with every point of praise Bratigan listed off, and she couldn't miss the note of pride creeping into his voice. After a few seconds, Bratigan set the lantern down and turned to Tika, his expression serious. But we ain't done yet. We need to test it. He lifted up the candle she had used earlier to harden the sealant and affixed it within the lantern. A moment passed. Suddenly, the runes along the frame of the lantern flared with light, glowing brilliantly in the workshop. The flame of the candle flickered a few times, and for a moment Tika feared it might go out. But then it stabilized, and the magic did its work. The warmth of the candle spread out, encompassing the entire table, and then the whole room. Were it not for the walls containing it, Tika had no doubts the warmth would have spread out all the way to the fountain in the plaza outside. Bratigan turned to her, grinning ear to ear. He threw his arms wide with a bellowing laugh. Tika, my girl, you did it! He shouted, all pretense of professionalism going right out the window. Tika similarly cast aside the stiff formalities and surged forward, allowing herself to be swept up into a warm and loving embrace from her dearest teacher. Or, well, swept down. She had grown significantly taller than him over the last couple of years, much to her endless delight and his disdain. The two practically jittered in place, laughing enthusiastically as all of the tension of the last several days of hard work faded away. Bratigan stepped back, his eyes misting over. Ah, Tika, look at you! Your first full commission under my tutelage, and you did it first try! I am so proud of you! Tika blushed at the praise, her beak clicking a few times and her neck feathers poofing up.
Aw, thanks, Brad,
she said, shifting her weight around a bit.
I couldn't have done it without your lessons, though.
Bratigan snickered, running his hand over his beard again. Yeah, I am pretty good, huh? He rumbled, his eyes sparkling. Glad to see I rubbed off on you. Tika rolled her eyes and playfully shoved him, drawing another chuckle. He turned back to the lantern and blew out the flame. The heat in the room plummeted back to the gentle chill of mid-autumn. He took a step back and stretched languidly with a satisfied yawn, his back giving a few pops. Tika giggled. The old dwarf had been sitting in that chair for a few hours now, she realized. He was bound to be just a little stiff. Ah! What a rush, Bratigan sighed, calming down somewhat. Now, all that's left to do is for me to deliver these suckers to Archshade, and we'll be done with this. You go on and get some rest, kiddo. You've been running yourself ragged for days getting this done. Tika's smile faded as Bratigan set about picking up the lantern and bringing it over to the storage box that housed the others. His movements were stiff, and she could hear the occasional grunt and grumble slip out as he worked. Now, Bratigan was by no means old, but neither was he particularly young anymore. And years upon years of hard work had visibly taken a toll on the dwarf.
Actually,
she piped up a second later as Bratigan hauled the box up, using his slightly protruding belly to support the underside. He turned to her with a quirked brow as she approached him, her cheeks lifting in the Kraven equivalent of a smile. She held out her hands.
Why don't you let me take care of the delivery?
Bratigan's eyebrow rose even higher. How come?
Well, for one thing,
Tika began as she hoisted the box out of Bratigan's arms and into her own. She nodded down slightly, a knowing smirk crossing her face.
I made these. Maybe I ought to deliver them. And secondly, and more importantly, your knees aren't so good anymore.
Bratigan's face flushed with equal parts indignation, outrage, and resigned embarrassment. What? Hey! You take that back, little missy. I'll have you know my knees are in perfect shape for my age. Watch.
Brad, no.
Too late. Bratigan went to do a squat. The air was filled with a series of popping noises, and Bratigan's face was contorted in discomfort when he rose.
Brad,
Tika sighed, shaking her head.
Come on.
Once the pain faded from Bratigan's face, he gestured wildly at Tika while spluttering indignant gibberish at her. This lasted for a few ineffectual seconds before he threw his hands up into the air with a furious groan. Ah! When did you start being right? He demanded. Tika snickered.
Hey, you taught me, remember?
To enchant things, Tika! Tika grinned before getting things back on topic.
My point is, you still have a lot of work to do up here in the workshop. I mean, have you even touched your notes since we got this commission?
Bratigan puffed up at her, stubbornly crossing his arms and tapping his foot in a way that told Tika that she had already won the argument, and all that remained were a few theatrical formalities. A moment later, Bratigan looked off to one side. No. I was too busy watching you work, he relented tiredly. Tika nodded.
Well, there you go. You should stay here and get caught up on that. The folks up at the assemblage aren't going to be too happy if you go to give a big lecture and break down in front of the entire student body because you forgot to prepare your talking points.
Bratigan, at last defeated, threw his arms up into the air again. He shuffled grumpily out of Tika's way. All right, fine. You win, lass. Just don't get lost. Tika nodded happily.
You worry too much. I can look after myself.
Bratigan opened his mouth.
That was when I was 8.
Bratigan shut his mouth. Tika chirped, pleased with the outcome of the conversation, and walked past Bratigan.
I'll be back soon, Brad.
As she passed, she took the opportunity to lean down and peck him lightly on top of the head. Bratigan brushed her off with a laugh. You feather-brained little... Get out of here! He exclaimed, swatting at the unrepentant Kraven with balled-up fists. Tika skipped lightly away from him and stuck out her tongue before she slipped through the door of the workshop. After that, it was a quick jaunt through the front room and out into the streets of Underbridge. The sun was high in the sky as she emerged, and she had to squint for a moment to let her eyes adjust to the relative brightness of the outside world. But they adjusted quickly, and she was once again greeted by the delightful sight of the great plaza Bratigan's workshop presided over. The fountain sat bubbling away in the beating heart of the space, and the back and forth foot traffic of men and women going about their day filled the air with the unmistakable white noise of civilization. Tika took it all in for a moment, savoring the sound in the chilly autumn air. She glanced up at the sky. Past the glow of the pale ring, the sun was setting earlier and earlier with every passing day. She had no doubts that she would be seeing her own breaths in the air in the next few weeks.
You remember the way, right?
Bratigan's voice reached her from the entrance to the shop. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed.
Yep, I remember,
Tika assured him. Bratigan relaxed somewhat.
Good. You be careful down there.
You worry too much.
Tika rolled her eyes. She set the box down in a wheelbarrow and lifted it up. The old wheels and well-used wood groaned in protest at the sudden weight, but Tika was confident it would hold. She gave Bratigan one more smile.
I'll be back later.
And with that, she was off. Bratigan watched her go, and his warm, affectionate smile slowly fell away as silence came over the workshop. Bratigan closed and locked the doors with an echoing thud and a soft click. Tika would have taken a key with her, so he didn't have to worry about her not being able to get back inside, and he didn't want any distractions. He leisurely ambled out of the front room and into the living quarters of the establishment. The bulk of the space consisted of a long corridor with doors set into the right side, each one leading to different rooms. First was the restroom, then the kitchen, pantry, and dining room, a broom cupboard, and then Tika's bedroom. Once upon a time, that room had been a storage closet. Now, though, Bratigan couldn't imagine it without the chirpy bird living in it. He paused for a moment, and then shook his head, letting out a chuckle.
The girl's right. I must be getting old.
He grumbled nostalgically.
Getting sentimental.
He dipped briefly into the kitchen to get a mug of tea, and then stepped through the door at the end of the hall into his own bedroom. He cast his eyes about, shutting the door behind him. Across from him was a well-made wooden desk covered with stacks of parchment and books on a wide variety of subjects. A window sat above it, allowing a shaft of natural sunlight to stream in through the curtains. Off to the right were all of the other expected amenities of a bedroom. His bed, a small chest, a wardrobe, a vanity, and a few other essentials. Perhaps the most eye-catching facet of the room, however, were the numerous sketches and colorful drawings that had been pinned to the walls over the years. A few were old diagrams and sketches Bratigan had been particularly proud of from the early years of his career. There was also the certificate that served as legal proof of his authority to practice enchantment within Emiro's borders. But those had all but been buried under layer after layer of silly, childish drawings or doodles. All of them were courtesy of Tika, and Bratigan had kept as many as he could. They covered everything from silly sketches of chickens running from the sun to birds in flight over the ocean to depictions of the city itself, and so many more. Bratigan's personal favorite was pinned to the wall right by his bed, a drawing of him and Tika holding hands. She was a lot smaller than him in that picture. Bratigan hummed, hit by another wave of nostalgia. He had been collecting these drawings for nearly as long as Tika had been living with him. And she had been with him for years now. It really didn't feel that way. It felt like it was only last week that the fresh-faced little bird was stepping into his shop for the first time, relieved to be out of the intimidating city streets and gawping at every little thing he owned with wide eyes and joyful coos. But it had been years. And now, Tika was set and poised to graduate.
Oh, time flies,
Bratigan mused. It was a strange thought, Tika graduating and leaving, possibly even for good this time. They had always set time aside each season for her to go and visit her family. She'd be gone for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, and then he'd ride out to her little countryside village to pick her up and bring her back, both of them ready and eager to begin the next string of lessons. The mere thought that this would be the last time she'd be leaving? It was an uncomfortable thought, and Bratigan cast it aside. He could address it later, he decided. Taking a slurp of his tea, he pulled open a drawer in his desk and pulled out a tall stack of paper. Each sheet was blank and ready for him to write. He procured an inkwell and quill and sat down to work. He wrote for several minutes. The only sound in the room was the scratching of his quill tip on parchment and the occasional sip as he enjoyed his tea. But the more he wrote, the more he found his attention waning. His eyes were pulled to the drawings on the walls. It wasn't long before he caught his hand stilled mid-word and his mind thinking of the past. Instead of shaking himself out of it and focusing back on the task at hand, though, Bratigan merely sighed, cursing his newfound sentimentality.
That lass is well on her way to surpassing me,
he thought to himself, stroking his beard.
And she is right. I ain't getting any younger.
A thought occurred to him then, one he was not willing to let go. His lips twitched up into a small semblance of a smile.
But like hell am I gonna let her go that easy,
he thought. A little piece of trivia echoed through Tika's mind as she passed the threshold that divided Archshade from the Arch. The city of Underbridge had been founded in the center of the southern crater heartland, a vast and open grassland marked here and there with verdant patches of forestation and rigidly kept grids of farmland. There were numerous rivers that flowed through the region, many of which served as the homes for small farming communities and pit-stop settlements. Now, for the uninitiated, it would make logical sense to assume that Underbridge was built upon the shores of such a river. But this was not the case. Rather, it had been built under, around, and on top of a massive archway of stone that rose seemingly naturally out of the land. At its base, the slope was gentle enough for a hiker to ascend to the arch's peak with minimal difficulty. The arch formed a natural bridge over a strange lake, not fed into by any rivers, at least none that were visible on the surface. Numerous species of fish inhabited that lake that could not be found elsewhere. The first settlers built their homes on the shores of the lake under that natural bridge. It was for this reason that the city was granted its name, Underbridge. Now, Tika had spent most of her time in the Arch, the upper city built on the bridge. She rarely had the chance to descend into Archshade, the lower district that, as the name implied, sat in the shadow of the Arch. The light of the sun and the pale ring were not so bright down here, only shining bright at dawn and dusk. Tika drew up to a halt and took it all in. The lake sprawled out before her, deep and vibrant, and she could just make out the hazy shapes of fishing boats inching across the water's surface. Upon the rocky shores were densely packed collections of cobbled stone houses, haphazardly built atop one another like a poorly balanced stack of cards. Part of her felt like they might topple at any moment. Bridges made of rope and old wood were strung from rooftop to rooftop in a complex latticework of pathways that Tika imagined would be very easy to get lost in. She could see the fiery glow of lanterns scattered throughout the streets. It was almost like staring at the night sky, if the stars beyond the ring's glow happened to be on fire. She stopped for a minute to appreciate the view. A chill wind whistled up the street and right into her a moment later, ending her appreciation. A shudder crept down her spine as the breeze stole the warmth out of her, prompting her to draw her clothes tighter around herself. She set off once more, moving faster in the hope of getting out of the wind and warming herself up. As she walked, she pulled out a slip of parchment from her pouch. It was the official contract that she and Bratigan had signed when they'd been commissioned to make these lanterns. On it were instructions on where to deliver the goods. The client, a man named Robin, had set up shop in a place called the Ivy Plaza. Tika read over the instructions once more and gave a sharp nod.
I'm pretty close already by the looks of things. This'll be a cakewalk.
Ivy Plaza came into sight a few minutes later. Tika drew to a halt and let out a whistle of appreciation. The plaza consisted of a circle of tiny homes and businesses surrounding a tall lamppost. Coils of lush green ivy wrapped around it, no doubt the plaza's namesake. Squares of colorful cloth hung from the walls of the buildings or stretched across the gaps between their roofs. Colored paper lanterns dangled from ropes overhead, providing colorful, welcoming light. In all, Tika thought it was very cozy. At the far end, a simple two-story building stood taller and sturdier than its neighbors. A sign hung from a post in front of the door, reading Robin's Textiles.
Not a particularly imaginative name for a shop, is it?
Tika thought. But if this Robin fellow had enough coin to buy a bunch of magic lanterns, she supposed he was doing something right. Tika came up to the door, set down her wheelbarrow, and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door opened, and a human man, looking to be in his late 30s, poked his face out. He squinted at her. "Yeah? What you need?" he asked, his voice like tree bark on cobblestone. Tika cleared her throat and stood up tall, trying to put on her business face.
You're Mr. Robin, yes?
She asked. I am. What do you want? Robin asked, opening his door wider and giving Tika an appraising look. Haven't I seen you around here somewhere before? Tika nodded.
Yep, you sure did,
she declared, before stepping off to the side and gesturing at the barrow.
Tika the Enchantress at your service. And fresh off the workbench from Bratigan's workshop, I bring you your commission, sir. It's complete.
Robin's eyes widened, his fingers snapping in a gesture of abrupt realization. Ah, right, you're the little bird Bratigan keeps around, he exclaimed. He grinned happily at her, then stepped out to survey the product of Tika's labor. He lifted one of the lamps, looking it over. Mind if I give him a quick test? Tika shook her head.
No, by all means, be my guest.
Robin shuffled briefly back into his shop. When he came back a few moments later, he was accompanied by an aura of warmth radiating from the lantern, a fresh candle lit up within. His grin was enormous and infinitely gratifying to see. He turned to Tika. Well, I'll be. I'd heard that Bratigan did good work, but I'd always been intimidated by the price tag. But this? He lifted up the lantern, missing the sour grimace crossing Tika's features. "Oh, this is gonna save my hide come the winter, let me tell ya." Tika clacked her beak.
I'm glad to hear you're satisfied with my work.
Robin blinked, turning to Tika. "Your work?" He parroted dumbly before another look of realization flashed across his face. He flushed with embarrassment and slapped a hand against his forehead. "Ah, shite! These are yours? I'm so sorry. I thought you were just Bratigan's assistant. I didn't know you enchanted things too." Tika huffed in irritation, then shook her head dismissively.
No, it's all right,
she said, although in truth there was a bit of a sting. An irrational one, she knew, but still. An awkward moment passed. Robin coughed, tucked the lantern under his arm, and reached down to his side. Anyway, he mumbled before holding out a pouch of coins to Tika. "Here's the rest of your payment, lass." Tika took the pouch with a warm smile.
Thank you, sir,
she said, her moment of offense already forgotten.
Do you need any help getting them set up?
Robin shook his head. No, I think I got it. I mean, I just put him down and light him up, right?" Tika snickered.
Mostly. You'll want to make sure the runes don't get disturbed, though. If you go to clean the lanterns, be gentle. And don't use anything too rough or coarse near the runes. If those get disrupted, the magic goes away. Try not to jostle them too hard, or the ringstone might cut loose or get damaged. Keep them dry, and take good care of them, and they should last you for several years.
Robin nodded along. "All right, I think I understand. Thanks, lass. And, sorry again." Tika rolled her eyes and waved a hand at him.
Don't worry about it. You're fine,
she said before stepping back and allowing Robin to take the box of lanterns inside. The two exchanged farewells, and a moment later, the door closed. Tika was on her own. She took a breath, folding her hands behind her back. That was it then. Her first full project as an enchantress. Every step of it had been her responsibility, and now it was complete. A wave of quiet giddiness came over her, and she couldn't stop herself from hopping up and down in place with a series of high-pitched chirps. She brought her fists up to the underside of her beak, allowing the satisfaction to fill her for a few minutes. She didn't even mind that people were staring at her. For as small as that interaction might have been, that one moment had been the culmination of the last several years of her life, and darn it, she was going to savor it. It took her a few minutes to finally get a hold of herself. Pleased as punch, she lifted the wheelbarrow and turned around, ready to head back. There was always more work to be done at the workshop, after all. She had only made it halfway across the plaza when something stopped her. It was a sound, high and sharp, like the whistle of a songbird. It echoed distantly between the buildings of Archshade from somewhere in the direction of the shore. Tika came to a halt and turned in its direction, surprised.
What is that?
She wondered. She listened to the sound for a few more seconds. It was beautiful, and she found herself instantly intrigued. She looked down at her wheelbarrow, up the road to the upper city, and then in the direction of that gorgeous noise. Curious, she took a few steps toward the sound. She hesitated. She didn't have time to waste down here. She had to get back to Bratigan in the workshop. But that noise, that mystical, mesmerizing noise, held her in place. There was no doubt about it as she listened that it was someone whistling. Full, Steady, melodious, musical. Could it possibly be another Kraven? Tika knew that humans and dwarves could whistle, but never once had she heard them whistle like this. She fidgeted for a moment, glancing back at her wheelbarrow, and then back toward the whistling. She had to get back to Bratigan, yes. But what was the rush, really? The man had gotten on just fine before she had shown up, and she had faith that he hadn't become dependent on her during their time together. The prospect of meeting another Kraven down here was enticing, and she had always wanted an excuse to explore the lower city.
Well, it's not like a few extra minutes away will hurt anything,
she eventually decided. And with that, she was setting off for the whistling at a brisk jog, leaving the wheelbarrow behind. She would come back for it later, she reasoned. The streets were claustrophobic in this part of the city. The buildings were clustered tightly together, and the problem only grew worse the closer Tika drew to the whistling, compounded by the tides of unhurried people going about their day. Tika found herself struggling to make good progress against the throng of moving bodies, their indistinct chatter making it harder to hear the sound of the whistling.
Excuse me? Pardon me. Coming through? Ah!
Tika panted as she ducked and weaved between people wherever she could find an opening, careful not to collide with any of them. The crowd deadened her senses, and the way the whistling was echoing off the walls confused her sense of direction. It took all of her focus not to get turned around. But finally, after a few more minutes of running, she came sliding around a bend, and the whistling came into sharp relief. The street before her went for another 20 feet or so before transitioning to a wooden pier that stretched out over the water of the lake. Tika slid to a stop, almost toppling over from her own momentum. Somewhere along the way, her jogging had turned into a full-on run, leaving her short of breath and sweating. Up ahead, the whistling continued, soothing and serene. Once her panting was under control, Tika drew herself back up and stepped onto the pier. The wooden pathway was but one of many that, much like the bridges connecting the roofs around the Ivy Plaza, formed a crisscrossing network of paths over the water. Numerous rowboats were tied to the support posts, bobbing gently with the rolling of the waves. No one was here right now, and the clamor of the city was muted and almost inaudible, leaving just the chilling howl of the wind whistling under the arch and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Tika looked at it all for a moment, again reminded of flaming stars as she saw the distant lights of the city. Her eyes drifted slowly to the right, and the source of the whistling came into sight. No Kraven met her eyes, but a young human woman. She had a head of messy, reddish-brown hair that hung loosely around the sides of her face. From here, Tika could see the beautiful shade of green in the human's eyes, and the cute freckles peppering her cheeks and forehead. She wore a plain green shirt with a matching skirt that hung down to her ankles. A beautifully crafted bracelet was clasped tightly around her left wrist, catching the low light of arch shade in such a way that it almost appeared to glow. She was sitting on the edge of the pier, her feet bare and swinging gently back and forth so that her toes teased the water's surface. Her shoes sat beside her on the pier. In her lap was a collection of sticks and mosses that she worked like a crochet artist. Tika stood perfectly still. She was just staring at the girl, the rest of the world fading out of her mind. She felt heat creeping up her neck and cheeks, and her feathers poofed up a little of their own accord, for reasons she did not understand. Her heart beat a little faster, her fingertips tingled, and it felt like there were butterflies frolicking around in her belly. She felt an almost irresistible urge to sing along to the aimless whistling, but resist she did, as if she were afraid that even the tiniest peep would scare away a small, frightened animal. It goes without saying, but at that moment, Tika was hopelessly and irreversibly enchanted.